March 1968, two companies of the 11th Brigade, 23rd Division, went berserk in the Vietnamese village of My Lai, killing, raping, and mutilating nearly 500 men, women, and children. The atrocity may have remained a close-kept secret had it not been for journalists Seymour Hersh and US GI Rod Ridenour, who had been told of the massacre by friends who had been there, and wrote to Congress and many other officials, both military and non-military. After nearly 20 months of delays, whitewashing, and the publication of Hersh's article in the New York Times, the US Army finally admitted that something had happened at My Lai. In the end, only one man served any time at all for his role in the massacre. Lieutenant William Calley, who died in April 2024, was eventually found guilty of 22 counts of murder and spent 3 years of a life sentence at home after President Nixon became involved. Unbelievably, despite all the evidence, including photos, maps, eyewitness accounts, and other evidence, a large number of Americans either denied that the massacre even happened or treated it as some heroic act by a soldier just doing his duty. In March 1971, as the massacre became widely known, a song called The Battle Hymn of Lieutenant Calley was released and made it to number 37 on the Billboard Hot 100. In the song, which you can find on YouTube, Calley is made out to be the epitome of the American hero, stalwart, calm, responsible, and patriotic. And all the killing, they were the enemy, not little kids and old ladies. Honestly, it's kind of sickening to listen to, but it's the perfect illustration of how divided the United States was over the Vietnam War. Welcome to a day in history. Today, the other massacres in Vietnam. Sadly, My Lai was not a one-off situation. Hundreds of other war crimes and massacres occurred during the war, and hardly a soul was punished for them. Actually, a massacre happened not far from My Lai on the very same day. The hamlet of My Khe, which is the US name for a hamlet that was part of the larger village of Sun My, between 4 to 5 miles from My Lai. Every massacre or human rights abuse has a reason. Sometimes the reasons are quite plain, like the Germans' merciless targeting of Jews and other groups they found inferior. And though there were certainly racial elements mixed into what happened at My Lai, the soldiers there did not target the civilians there simply because they were Vietnamese. Many of the GIs, and My Lai, My Khe, and other places took out months of frustration, as booby traps and mines claimed more lives than enemy bullets. Frustrated and infuriated by their inability to stop these seemingly random incidents, soldiers took out their rage and frustration on Vietnamese villagers, most of whom the GIs believed were members of the VC, the Viet Cong Communist Guerrilla Movement, or sympathetic towards it. Add in language and cultural barriers, the age of the Americans, most were in their late teens and early 20s, and most importantly, the permission of their commanding officers, and a fatal combination was created. These are not excuses, and neither is the fact that the Viet Cong committed more than their share of war crimes, but a broad explanation of why My Lai, My Khe, and other massacres happened. Our writer was a boy during the Vietnam War, and he and his friends found an old copy of the Ballad of Lieutenant Calley in a box in a dusty basement. Everyone, even 10-year-olds, heard of My Lai, especially kids whose parents and older relatives had served there. However, in the 50 years since the end of the Vietnam War, he had never heard of the Mikay Massacre. Why? For a variety of reasons. The number of men thought to have carried out the killings was small, perhaps a dozen. When the investigation of My Lai began, the killings at My Khe were also investigated. There was no doubt whatsoever that US troops killed Vietnamese civilians. Their bodies were lying all around the hamlet. Pictures were taken, and an eyewitness not only gave testimony, but led army investigators through the village and the events there. Like My Lai, the Mikay Massacre was prompted by a GI getting severely wounded by a mine as the unit approached the hamlet. Accounts differ slightly, with some saying the killing began when a helicopter gunship began firing into the hamlet with rockets and machine guns. Others say that a platoon-sized group had moved into the area about the same time and were entering the hamlet as the chopper was either beginning to fire or was leaving. The soldiers were told by their commanding officer that everyone in the village was VC or VC sympathizers, and that the threat needed to be eliminated. With that, at least 10 soldiers, maybe more, began opening fire on the village and villagers with their M16s and a .50 caliber machine gun. At close range, a .50 caliber shell will almost completely obliterate its target, especially if they're children. When the firing stopped, 90 Vietnamese civilians, most of them women, children, and older adults, were dead. When word got out about My Lai and My Khe, a wall of silence went up among the soldiers who had allegedly taken part in the killings at My Khe. By the time of the investigation into My Lai, 2 of the men who were thought to have participated had been killed in action, and the other 8 claimed they didn't know anything or didn't remember. The wording in the official army report makes it clear that investigators did not believe the men. Still, as opposed to My Lai, where dozens of soldiers took part, there was only a small number at My Khe, and they circled the wagons and never broke their silence. No one was ever prosecuted for the actions of the US Army at My Khe. Around 500 people were killed at My Lai and My Khe, but the truth is that incidents like them happened regularly during the Vietnam War. Most of the victims were civilians. Some were victims of the randomness and brutality of war, being in the wrong field at the wrong time as a young chopper gunner had fun opening up on both water buffalo and people from above, or walking along a village road when an artillery shell struck. However, many times those killings were directed, intentional, and widespread. Considerable numbers of Viet Cong operated in the Mekong River Delta, southwest of Saigon, known today as Ho Chi Minh City. In the case of the Phoenix program, the CIA and the South Vietnamese military, along with American units, carried out a devastating campaign against the VC, or anyone suspected of being Viet Cong. In 1967, the year that Phoenix began, there were an estimated 80 to 90,000 VC in the Delta. The Phoenix program differed from the relatively simple actions in which regular units were involved. Both the CIA and the CIO, the South Vietnamese Central Intelligence Organization, played an important part in intelligence gathering and psychological operations, most notably the Chiu Hoi program. The Chiu Hoi program was aimed at getting Viet Cong soldiers and operatives to change sides, and using a combination of real information and misinformation, as well as emotional appeals in pamphlets and on the radio, managed to convince an estimated 100,000 VC to change sides, or at least leave the field through much of the second half of the war. When PSYOPs didn't work, force did. Vietnamese troops with American advisors fanned out throughout the Delta and brought a wave of terror not only to the VC, but to civilians caught in the middle. To a large degree, the Phoenix program was the epitome of the popular US military phrase at the time: kill 'em all and let God sort them out. Unfortunately, frustration, hatred, misunderstanding, plain cruelty, and much else plagued the Phoenix program. 2 other things plagued it as well: torture and killing. The way the CIO, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, and the CIA found VC was all too often to grab someone who may have had the loosest ties to the VC or none at all and pressure them. In a close-knit wartime society, where villages all over South Vietnam were caught between the US and South Vietnamese and the VC, Villagers often knew who was VC and who was not. Despite the large and growing numbers of the movement, the Viet Cong never had a majority in South Vietnam, and many villages and towns hated them. The VC kidnapped and forcibly recruited men and women. They tortured villagers who didn't comply with their wishes, and they often used villagers to hide weapons and intelligence. Oftentimes, villagers knew that their neighbors were VC or knew someone who was, so being seen talking to the ARVN or Americans put villagers in a dangerous position as well. For the most part, the men of the Phoenix program did not care. Disappearances, most of the time permanent, happened regularly. Sometimes people were killed outright. Other times they were taken to prison. If they were lucky and really didn't know anything, they might be released after torture involving electric shock, mock executions, beatings, waterboarding, and other torture methods. Of course, the Americans involved in Project Phoenix were not allowed to torture people, which is why they worked with the CIO and ARVN. The South Vietnamese did not ban torture. This, of course, only increased the number of people joining or actively helping the Viet Cong. Phoenix also undertook military-type missions and worked with American units in the field. All too often, a village would be marked VC on a map, and it would be bombed, shelled, or burned. Many times, entire villages would be wiped out. The official post-war US government figure of people neutralized as VC assets by 1972 was about 80,000, of which over 25,000 were killed, shot on the spot, tortured to death, executed after trial, etc. And the United States Armed Forces and the White House knew about all of it. As the Phoenix program was sowing terror in the Delta, a regular US infantry division was carrying out a slash and burn campaign in the same area. For 5 months between December 1968 and May 1969, the 9th US Infantry, commanded by Major General Julian Ewell, went on a killing spree. Unlike Phoenix, Speedy Express had a simple goal: increase the 9th Division's body count. In Vietnam, the US found itself fighting against an enemy that mixed into the population, and often were the population. The Vietnam War was famous for having no front line. American military intelligence and the CIA had estimates they worked with, estimates of VC in certain areas. By the time the US began to pull out of Vietnam in 1972, the body count had become the rubric by which American progress was measured. The US and ARVN occupied cities and towns. The VC remained. They cleared villages and farmland, not only of suspected VC, but of all people. And the VC returned. With no front lines to show progress, the US government began to use body counts as the measure of success. The problem was that no matter how many VC, real or imagined, were killed, there always seemed to be more. The fact is that ruthless force in a guerrilla war is often counterproductive and actually increases enemy numbers. No matter, a high body count was a sign of success, not only for the entire US war effort, but for officers in the field. Officers commanding units with a high body count were seen as winners, and often chosen for fast-track career-changing promotions. Major General Ewell was one of those men. His nickname among his men and the enemy was the Butcher of the Delta, and essentially he ordered the men in the 9th to shoot first and ask questions later. Men commanding battalions, companies, and platoons with a high body count were often given leave as a reward, as well as promotions and medals. Since the army said it was okay, many men involved in Speedy Express felt they could do whatever they wanted to, and they did. At the end of May 1969, 10,889 enemy dead were reported, killed in raids of dozens of towns and villages throughout the Delta, and only just over 200 hidden weapons were found. Worse still, the killings during Speedy Express got out of hand, but no one did anything about it. Helicopters flying over busy fields would suddenly open fire, killing a dozen or so farmers, which were recorded as 12 dead VC in official records. Nighttime raids got truly grisly. Entire families were killed out of suspicion, and sometimes just because. Rape and the deaths of children also happened. Word about the atrocities of Speedy Express made it out of Vietnam, and to both journalists and government watchdogs in the USA. And despite official and secret reports of the abuses of the 9th during Speedy Express, not one person was ever prosecuted for the war crimes that occurred during the operation, just like most American atrocities in Vietnam. After all, Americans were supposed to be the good guys. Ewell, a highly decorated soldier and a hero of the defense of Bastogne in World War II, was promoted to lieutenant general at the end of Speedy Express, and later commanded NATO's Southern Command in Italy. Speedy Express worked out well for him, not so much for over 10,000 others, some of them children. Thank you for joining us today. See you next time.